Imagine you're a steamboat captain in 1818. You've got a perfectly legal federal license from Congress to operate your boat in coastal waters. You're running passengers between New Jersey and New York, making a good living. Then one day, a state sheriff shows up with a court order. You're banned from New York waters. Why? Because a former business partner has a state-issued monopoly license, and you don't. You protest, "But I have a federal license. Congress gave me permission." The sheriff shrugs. State law says you need a state license. Federal license doesn't matter here. Who's right? Can a state override federal law? Can Congress's authority trump a state monopoly? This was the dilemma facing Thomas Gibbons in 1818. His case, Gibbons versus Ogden, would reach the Supreme Court in 1824, and the answer would determine whether America would have a truly national economy or remain a patchwork of state-controlled local markets. It's also the third and final case in John Marshall's trilogy of federal power. First, he gave the court the power to strike down laws in Marbury. Then, he expanded federal power and supremacy in McCulloch. Now, in Gibbons, he would define just how far federal authority could reach, and in doing so, he would build the constitutional foundation for nearly every federal regulation you live under today. Let's see how a steamboat war between former business partners became the case that built the modern economy. The Steamboat Revolution. It's 1807, and Robert Fulton has just changed the world. On August 17th, his steamboat, the North River Steamboat, successfully travels from New York City to Albany, 150 miles, against the current, without sails, powered entirely by steam. This is revolutionary. For all of human history, water travel has meant sailing ships dependent on wind, or rowboats dependent on muscle. Steamboats change everything. They're faster, more reliable, and can travel upstream. They open rivers and coastlines to commerce like never before. Fulton knows he's onto something huge. So does his business partner, Robert Livingston, a politically connected New York aristocrat who helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. And they want to make sure nobody else can compete with them, and so they go to the New York State Legislature and get an exclusive monopoly. For the next 30 years, only they can operate steamboats in New York waters. Anyone else who wants to run steamboats in New York has to get a license from them and pay them handsomely for the privilege. It's a goldmine. New York controls access to one of the busiest harbors in America. If you want to move people or goods by steamboat anywhere near New York, you're paying Fulton and Livingston. Other states start copying this model. Connecticut grants monopolies. New Jersey grants monopolies. Suddenly, America's waterways are being carved up into state-controlled fiefdoms. And that's where the trouble starts. Enter the rivals. Fast forward to 1814. Aaron Ogden, former New Jersey governor, Revolutionary War hero, starts a steamboat service running between Elizabethtown, New Jersey, and New York City. He's smart. He gets a license from the Fulton-Livingston monopoly, plays by New York's rules, pays his fees, everything's legal. Then he meets Thomas Gibbons. Gibbons is a wealthy businessman who also operates steamboats, and he has something Ogden doesn't, a federal coasting license issued by Congress under federal law. The two men see an opportunity. In 1815, they form a partnership. They'll run steamboats together, combining Ogden's state license with Gibbons's federal one. For 3 years, it works. Then, like so many business partnerships, it falls apart. The reason? Money, ego, and ambition. The usual suspects. And when it falls apart, it gets ugly. The Steamboat War. After the partnership dissolves, Gibbons does something that infuriates Ogden. He starts operating another steamboat, the Bellona, on routes in New York waters that directly compete with Ogden. Ogden is furious. "You can't do that. I have the exclusive New York state license for these routes. You need my permission." Gibbons' response? "I don't need your state license. I have a federal license from Congress. Federal law says I can operate in coastal trade. New York can't stop me." This is the constitutional showdown. Two former partners, each claiming a different source of legal authority. Ogden sues Gibbons in New York State Court. The argument: Gibbons is violating New York law by operating without a state license in New York waters. Gibbons's defense: federal law trumps state law. His federal coasting license, issued under an act of Congress, gives him the right to operate. New York's monopoly can't override that. The New York court rules for Ogden, issues a permanent injunction. Gibbons is banned from New York waters. But Gibbons isn't done. He appeals to the US Supreme Court, and John Marshall is waiting. Marshall's third act. By 1824, John Marshall has been Chief Justice for 23 years. He's already authored two of the most important decisions in American history. In Marbury v. Madison, he established judicial review, the court's power to strike down unconstitutional laws. In McCulloch v. Maryland, he expansively interpreted federal power and declared federal supremacy over the states. Now, in Gibbons v. Ogden, he has a chance to complete the trilogy. The question, how far does federal power extend over commerce? This matters enormously. If states can create monopolies and control commerce within their borders, America will be a collection of separate economic zones, each with its own rules, barriers, and favoritism. But if federal power can override state monopolies and regulate interstate commerce broadly, America can have a truly national economy. Marshall knows which vision he prefers. He's a nationalist. He wants a strong, unified country, not a loose confederation of jealous states. The question is whether the Constitution gives him the tools to build it. The Commerce Clause. What does commerce mean? The whole case turns on Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. Sounds simple, but what does commerce actually mean? And how far does federal power over it extend? New York's lawyers argue for a narrow interpretation. They say commerce means buying and selling goods, trade, transactions. It doesn't include transportation or navigation. States have always regulated navigation. It's a traditional state power. The Commerce Clause doesn't take that away. And even if it did, they argue, the Commerce Clause only covers commerce among the several states. Ogden's steamboats operate within New York. That's purely internal state commerce. Congress has no authority over it. It's a clever argument. If Marshall accepts it, the federal coasting license is irrelevant. States control their own waters. Monopolies stand. But Marshall doesn't accept it. Marshall's definition, commerce is intercourse. Marshall writes one of his characteristically clear opinions. He starts by defining commerce. He writes, commerce undoubtedly is traffic, but it is something more. It is intercourse. Let that sink in. Commerce isn't just buying and selling. It's intercourse, meaning interaction, exchange, connection. It's the entire web of commercial activity between people and states. Does commerce include navigation? Obviously. How else do goods and people move between states? Steamboats carrying passengers from New Jersey to New York are engaged in commerce among the several states. There's no question about it. And Congress's power over that commerce? Marshall says it's complete. This power, like all others vested in Congress, is complete in itself, may be exercised to its utmost extent, and acknowledges no limitations other than are prescribed in the Constitution. Read that again. The power is complete. It can be exercised to its utmost extent. It has no limitations except what the Constitution itself prescribes. This is broad federal power. Very broad. Federal law wins. Marshall doesn't need to decide whether Congress's commerce power is exclusive, whether states can regulate commerce at all. He takes a narrower path. He looks at the Federal Coasting Act, the law under which Gibbons got his license. That act, passed by Congress, gives licenses to vessels engaged in coastal trade. Gibbons has one of these licenses. It authorizes his steamboat to operate in coastal waters. New York's monopoly law says Gibbons can't operate without a state license. These two laws conflict. Federal law says he can. State law says he can't. Which one wins? Marshall invokes the Supremacy Clause. When federal law and state law conflict and Congress is acting within its constitutional authority, federal law is supreme. Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. The Coasting Act is a valid exercise of that power. New York's monopoly law conflicts with it. Therefore, New York's law is unconstitutional as applied to vessels with federal licenses. Gibbons wins. The monopoly is broken. The immediate impact. The decision is unanimous. 6 justices, 1 voice, and the effect is immediate. The Livingston-Fulton monopoly collapses. New York can no longer ban federally licensed steamboats from its waters. But it's not just New York. Other states had granted similar monopolies. All of them fall. Competition explodes. Within a few years, Steamboat traffic on American waterways surges. Prices drop. Service improves. The steamboat becomes a critical part of American commerce. The monopolists lose. But the economy wins. And more importantly, America becomes a national market. States can't use licensing laws to create protectionist barriers or favor local interests over interstate commerce. Federal law ensures a level playing field. John Marshall just made economic nationalism a constitutional reality. The trilogy complete. Let's step back and see what Marshall has built. Marbury versus Madison, 1803. The court has the power to strike down unconstitutional laws. The judiciary is a co-equal branch. McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819. Congress has implied powers. The federal government can choose appropriate means to achieve constitutional ends. States can't interfere with federal operations. Federal supremacy is real. Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824. Congress's commerce power is broad and complete. It extends to all interstate commercial activity, including navigation and transportation. Federal law trumps conflicting state laws. Together, these three cases create the architecture of American federalism: a powerful national government with broad authority, a Supreme Court to enforce constitutional limits, and states that cannot interfere with federal supremacy. Marshall didn't just interpret the Constitution. He constructed a vision of America, one nation, unified, with a strong central government capable of acting decisively. Whether you think that's brilliant or tragic depends on your view of federal power, but there's no denying Marshall built it. The long shadow of Gibbons. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Because Gibbons didn't just settle a steamboat dispute, it became the constitutional foundation for nearly everything the federal government does. Marshall defined commerce among the several states broadly. Very broadly. And future courts took that ball and ran with it. By the 1930s and 40s, during the New Deal, the Supreme Court was upholding federal laws regulating wages, working conditions, agricultural production, all under the Commerce Clause authority established in Gibbons. In 1942, the court decided Wickard versus Filburn. A farmer named Filburn grew wheat on his own farm for his own consumption. Never sold it. Never transported it across state lines. Just grew it and used it himself. The federal government said, "You're violating our agricultural quotas. You grew too much wheat." Filburn said, "How can you regulate wheat I grew for myself? It's not commerce. It never entered any market." The court said, "But if lots of farmers do what you did, in aggregate it affects interstate wheat markets. So we can regulate it." That's how broad the Commerce Clause became. If your local activity, multiplied across millions of people, affects interstate commerce, Congress can regulate it. That logic traces directly to Gibbons, commerce and civil rights. Flash forward to the 1960s. Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits racial discrimination in hotels, restaurants, and other public accommodations. Constitutional challenge. Congress can't tell private businesses who to serve. That's not regulating commerce. The Supreme Court says, yes, it is. In Heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States, the court upholds the Civil Rights Act under the Commerce Clause. Why? Because hotels serve interstate travelers. Racial discrimination burdens interstate travel and commerce. Therefore, Congress can prohibit it. In Katzenbach versus McClung, the court applies the same logic to a local restaurant. Ollie's Barbecue in Birmingham, Alabama, discriminates against black customers. But it serves food that traveled in interstate commerce. That's enough. Congress can regulate it. Think about that. The constitutional power to end racial discrimination in public accommodations came from the Commerce Clause, the same clause Marshall interpreted in a steamboat case in 1824. Gibbons made the Civil Rights Act possible. The modern regulatory state. Today, if you eat food, the FDA regulates it under commerce power. If you take medicine, same. If you work, federal labor laws apply. Commerce power. If your workplace is safe, thank OSHA. Commerce power. If the air is breathable and the water is drinkable, thank the EPA. Commerce power. Antitrust enforcement? Commerce power. Securities regulation? Commerce power. Consumer protection? Commerce power. Nearly every federal regulation you encounter rests on Gibbons versus Ogden's interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Marshall gave Congress the tools. Congress built the modern regulatory state with them. The pushback. Of course, not everyone thinks this is great. Critics argue that the Commerce Clause has been stretched far beyond anything the founders intended. They point out that if growing wheat for your own consumption counts as interstate commerce, what doesn't? In the 1990s, the Supreme Court started pushing back. Slightly. In United States versus Lopez, 1995, the court struck down a federal law banning guns near schools. The court said, this isn't regulating commerce, this is regulating crime. That's a state matter, not a federal one. In United States versus Morrison, 2000, the court struck down part of the Violence Against Women Act. Again, the court said, non-economic violent crime isn't interstate commerce. These cases suggest there are limits, but they're pretty narrow exceptions. Gibbons's broad commerce power remains mostly intact. When Congress wants to regulate something, healthcare, environmental protection, labor conditions, it invokes the Commerce Clause, and usually it works. All thanks to a Steamboat case from 1824. The question that won't go away. So was Gibbons rightly decided? If you think America needs a strong federal government capable of addressing national problems, Gibbons is essential. Without it, you can't have federal environmental laws, civil rights protections, or a unified national economy. If you think the federal government has grown too powerful and that states should control most governance, Gibbons is where it went wrong. It opened the door to unlimited federal expansion. The founders themselves would have disagreed. Some, like Hamilton, wanted broad federal commerce power. Others, like Jefferson, wanted narrow federal power and strong states. Marshall sided with Hamilton, and his interpretation became law. But here's the thing. The text of the Commerce Clause doesn't clearly resolve this. To regulate commerce among the several states can mean narrow or broad depending on how you read commerce and among the several states. Marshall chose broad, and we've lived with that choice for 200 years. The steamboat captain who changed history. Thomas Gibbons won his case. He broke the monopoly. He got to run his steamboats. But his victory meant more than one man's business dispute. It meant that America would have a national economy, not a fragmented patchwork of state markets. It meant that federal power could reach into areas the Constitution doesn't explicitly mention as long as they connect to interstate commerce. It meant that Congress could build the regulatory state that governs almost every aspect of modern life. Aaron Ogden lost his monopoly, but more than that, he lost the vision of America he represented, one where states controlled commerce within their borders and federal power was narrow and limited. John Marshall once again built the framework of American government. Marbury gave the court power. McCulloch gave Congress flexibility. Gibbons gave federal authority reach. Together, they made the modern United States possible. Whether that's a triumph or a cautionary tale depends on where you stand on federal power. But there's no question. A steamboat war in 1824 became the foundation of the economy, the regulatory state, and the federal power you live under today. And it all started because two former business partners couldn't settle their differences. Sometimes the biggest constitutional questions come from the smallest disputes. And sometimes the fate of a nation turns on whether a steamboat captain needs a state license or a federal one. Gibbons versus Ogden answered that question. And in doing so, it answered the question of what kind of country America would become.